Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and Walt Schwank will be joining us shortly. We have a real treat for you today, an interview with ESPN reporter and author of a new book on the nWo, Marc Raimondi. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our conversation with Marc. We are so excited to have a very special guest on the show today. He is an ESPN reporter and, more importantly, the author of the upcoming book, Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. Marc Raimondi, welcome to Awesome Truth.
Thank you very much for having me, boys. I'm pretty excited about joining you guys today.
We're really excited to talk with you, especially about the nWo. And when we saw, so a few weeks ago, we saw your tweet about announcing the book coming out next year. And you kind of gave a little bit of insight as to like what the book was about and a little bit about, I've read some stuff that some of the origin story about Simon & Schuster coming to you with the idea a few years ago. Just take us through the origins of this project and how, I guess, where we're at today with it.
Yeah, so it's 2021, and I'm sitting in a hotel room in Houston, Texas. I'm there covering a UFC fight because for the last 11 years, up until recently, I was mainly a combat sports reporter, mostly UFC, and I pretty much followed the UFC, around the world, covering all the big fights. It's like a traveling circus. So I'm in Houston, I'm in a hotel room, and I get an email from someone who says they are the editor at Simon & Schuster. And they are asking me if I want to write a book about the nWo. And the first thing that I think is, okay, yeah, there's no way this is real. This has to be fake. This is a scam. This is BS, because how could anyone who gets those emails, right? It's gotta be not true. So I did some research. I Googled the editor, and it turns out it was true. Within a few minutes, I'm on the phone with him. Shout out Yadon Israel. He's a fantastic editor at Simon & Schuster. And we started really talking about the nWo, but like on a deeper level than your regular surface level pro wrestling conversation, because it had so much meaning and so much impact, and we were really on the same page, no pun intended, very quickly. Like literally within the first conversation, we're like, all right, this is a real thing, and then the rest is kind of history from there. I had to hire like a book agent. I wasn't thinking about writing a book. I was just trying to do my job for ESPN at the time. I had to write a book proposal, and it was a whole thing. And, fast forward, it's been over 3 years now since I got that email, and we're getting closer. It's 9 months away, actually to the day. It's March 25th, 2025 is the release date. It's out for pre-order right now. And it's I guess it's a real thing. No more Googling to see if it's fake or not.
That's great, Marc. That's amazing to get that email. I couldn't imagine. Hopefully Walt and I will get that email someday. Hey, do you want to produce something about pro wrestling? We're still waiting for it. But I'm wondering, as you guys had that conversation about the nWo, because obviously there's been a ton of WCW books. There's documentary series on right now, like a topic that has been covered, we would say ad nauseum as amateur wrestling historians on the show. A lot of WCW stuff out there. Was there a conversation about how to have it stand out? Like how to not retread the same old ground, how to sort of make, obviously the nWo is cool. They're always going to be cool. But was there a thought like, I want this to be a sort of as best I can to make it a different route into how to tell the story?
100%. That was one of like my main focuses going into the book. And like I said, the conversation that I had with my editor, Yadon, it was not a pro wrestling conversation. It was a cultural conversation. It was, hey, the nWo was cool, and it's the reason why XYZ and so on happened. And that's what the book is really about. It's a pro wrestling book. There's no doubt about it. It's a pro wrestling book. And I want pro wrestling fans to pick it up and enjoy it. And I did my best to, give them the inside info and stuff they didn't know before. But it's a pop culture book. It's a sociological book. It's a history book. It's a lot more than just a pro wrestling book. And that's really what I wanted it to be, what we wanted it to be, and what it needed to be, because like you said, there is so much out there already about that era of WCW specifically. So this is going to be different. Will there be some of the same things? Of course, there's no doubt. But I interviewed people that no one has ever interviewed before about professional wrestling. I can promise you that. And there should be some eye-opening conversations, some eye-opening quotes in the book, and eye-opening theories and eye-opening, hypotheses and so on.
Yeah, and it's easy for Walt and I to say this because we were born in 1985, so we were, 12 when this happened. The perfect age.
I'm 84.
There you go.
So
we were
right
all
there
like right in that wheelhouse, to say the least. But I mean, we wore wrestling shirts to school, at a time when we probably shouldn't have been, because we were turning, getting a little old, too old for that. But it was big in a way that obviously, and probably, and obviously with Steve Austin, it was even bigger, and The Rock, but big in a way, it was sort of a movement and a pop culture idea that has never really been replicated in wrestling since. So I don't think it's grandiose at all to say this had tendrils that extended beyond, wrestling aficionados who watched on Monday nights.
Well, the subtitle of the book is it's a tough one, right? Because it says how it changed America. So that was kind of what I was going to the book thinking. How am I going to form the hypothesis and try to prove the theory, right? How do I prove that? And to me, on a basic level, right? You guys were born in 1985. I was born in 84. We are, in our late 30s, early 40s, we'll say, right? You guys turned 40 this year. Congratulations, right? Actually, last year. Yeah. So I turned 40 this year. So everyone that was watching pro wrestling during that period of time in the mid to late 90s was, at that point, a teen, 20-something, 30-something, mostly men. And if you fast forward now to 2024, these are people that are established in their industries. They're whatever they're doing, the different sectors of where they're working. And they are, in many cases, leaders of their industries, whether we're talking about Hollywood or politics or cable news or music. And that period, everyone was watching it. How could that not have taken some effect? How could that not have shaped some of who we are and the decisions that we make now as, I hate to say this word, middle-aged men, and we're doing what we're doing in the world, and we're helping shape the world by what we knew as a kid. And if you look at, to me, when I look at the world, I see pro wrestling all around. I see it everywhere. I see it on cable news. I see the talking heads and the arguing and the manufactured conflict. If you can't see it in politics, I can't help you, because it's all over politics. It's on sports news. It's on social media, because everyone's really just playing a character on there, right? It's all kayfabe at the end of the day on social media. That's not really our real, true selves. Pro wrestling is everywhere, and I think that is the reason why the mid-1990s, which was kicked off by the nWo, has had an enormous effect on the country that we live in 2024.
Yeah. Obviously, you're a journalist by trade, and so to make this argument, to have this thesis statement that you make right on the cover, like you said, you interview people outside of wrestling, because it's easy to be in that bubble of like, oh, this is so important. This has got 10 million people every Monday night watching the nWo spray paint another person or throw someone else into a production truck. Like, to us, to fans, it was like obviously like big. I'm curious, in your booking process and in your interviewing process, was there anyone surprising? You're like, wait, you were watching this too? Or, oh, this is important to you? I would have never guessed that.
Every industry that I mentioned before, I interviewed people from those industries. I interviewed a presidential candidate, recent presidential candidate. I interviewed people in Hollywood. I interviewed a Hollywood producer who has been involved in some of the biggest shows right now. I interviewed people in music. It has had that kind of that permeation into all aspects of society. And again, people don't even realize it. People who are not wrestling fans don't even realize that. They just kind of go about their days, and they see kind of the state of the United States, and they don't realize that it all started somewhere. And again, maybe people are going to crap on this idea, but I feel like that's where it started. 10 million people at an impressionable age watching professional wrestling in the 90s every single week. That changes you. And look, as far as the impact goes, right, I bought an nWo hoodie from Hulk Hogan's beach shop down in Clearwater, Florida, a couple years ago. Right when I was starting to do the book, and I bought the hoodie. I was kind of searching for Hogan. Didn't find Hogan, but I found the hoodie, and I wore it to to the airport for most of my UFC trips over the last few years. And I think it's like an 85% clip that someone says something about the nWo hoodie. And I told this story on a couple other podcasts, but I was at LAX, which is just a miserable place to be, right? And I had an early morning flight to Newark, New Jersey, and it was like, I think I was getting there like 4:30 in the morning, 4:30 a.m. Got my nWo hoodie on. I'm going through TSA, and the TSA agent, who looked to be a little bit younger than me, starts humming the nWo theme song as I'm going through the metal detector. And then when I get to the other side of the metal detector, I get the Too Sweet. I get the Wolfpack sign from him. It's like I had my own like theme music coming through the metal detector going to LAX. I mean, that is the kind of thing. It's like, what other thing, has happened in this country that it has that kind of like power, and not just power, but also just like lasting effect on people. And it's the nWo, and it's pro wrestling in the 90s.
I would bet money that, I forget the total number. You might know from reading the book that Vince ended up spending to buy WCW, which I think was a couple $1,000,000, maybe like 10. I remember it was a very long. I was gonna say, I bet he's eclipsed that number in nWo t-shirt sales from that
Easily.
day like 10 times over. Like it still sells. People still know what it is today, and it's about 29 years from when the book comes out. It'll be about 29 years since they debuted. There's like you said, there's very few things. There's Austin 316. There's the original Hulkamania. Beyond that, what has the lasting power that really held out that long? Like the list is incredibly short.
Eric Bischoff told me that when he was back working for WWE in like 2018, 2019, he was able to see like the merchandise like charts. And he told me that the nWo shirts were still like well in the top 10 the nWo like merchandise itself was well in the top 10 of things that are still making a ton of money for WWE.
That's wild. I don't doubt it for a second. It's so simple and so iconic too. Like it's one of the, Walt and I, again, we used to wear wrestling shirts when we were in middle school. I think by high school we were done, but it's one of those shirts that if you wear it now, it's not like there's so many embarrassing wrestling attire out there in general, like big logos, Randy Orton snakes all over, like stuff where you just look, it looks like you wouldn't be caught dead wearing that. But nWo, you can wear that and it's not so aggressively embarrassing that you couldn't wear it to the airport. You can wear it in public. Like it has that sort of vibe wherever you put it on. Beyond it being like, old school now and nostalgic and all that, it's just simple and elegant, like it works in so many contexts, which again is so much a departure from other wrestling gear.
And what's funny about that too is like and I wrote quite a bit about this in the book, is like it's such an iconic logo, right? Yet the process of building like the marketing and the logo itself and the merchandising was so chaotic and haphazard. Like they really just didn't, like they knew they had to market this thing and they knew it was going to be a thing, but everything was by the seat of the pants. There was no like long-term plans. There was no, they just had to execute like right away. And even like the process of making of the logo was like 30 minutes, an hour, and then I'll go more into that in the book. But yeah, we're talking about something that is like long lasting. This is 30 years old almost, right? And it's still, if you go to a wrestling show today, you're going to see dozens of nWo shirts. And sometimes you'll see one on the street, from 30 years ago. And that logo, like the amount of thought that was put into it and then like the actual like putting it onto paper was such a small amount of time, and the lasting effect that it's had, it's like it's unreal.
So I'm curious because we can see, well, for people listening to the podcast, you can see this, but I see a number of books in your background.
Yeah,
I think that one of them is the Bret Hart biography, which we definitely covered.
My number one wrestling book of all time.
Yeah.
And there's we've read way too many wrestling books in the many years we've been doing this, and I'm curious, just like what books in this space have you read, that anything that you're like, hey, I want to take elements of this. Obviously, your background lends itself to a more journalistic approach potentially, which is, we've seen that approach too in various iterations, and that also has a different you elicit different answers and get different stories when you kind of take that approach. And I'm just curious, like, what have you read and what do you like, and what are you like, hey, I want to do it like that, or you're like, I don't want to do it like that?
It's I've read a ton of wrestling books over the years, right? I think the first one that I read was Mick Foley, Have a Nice Day, when I was a kid. That was like, I love that book. It was just I don't know if I've enjoyed reading a book as much as I enjoyed reading that one, because it was just so awesome at the time to read Mick Foley's book. But as far as like what I wanted to do, like how I wanted to execute this book, it was definitely a journalistic approach, because that is my background, and I didn't want to deviate from my background and what I do well, because I think that would be like that would be a disservice to myself and to others, because why would I, maybe one day I'll get out of my comfort zone and write like a novel or something, but for now it's like I know how to report, and I did almost 100 interviews for this book, and I watched over 500 hours of WCW from that time period, which was kind of mind-numbing, if I'm being honest. But total journalistic approach, and it was hard though, and I think one of the things that you're asking is, like, when you interview people during, who were there at the time, memories tend to fade or change, or maybe intentionally change. So it was one of the hardest parts was trying to, like, find, like, get the real story, or at least close to the real story, from different sources. And that was not always easy to do, but I did my darndest to give at least the different sides of what happened, because sometimes Kevin Nash and Art Bischoff would have a different side of the story, or Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan, and Scott Hall, and whatever. So that was not easy to do, I would say. But yeah, as far as style, I don't know if I took anything from, like, I mean, I certainly, everyone is a copycat in a way, right? So I can't pinpoint exactly who, like, what I copied, but probably a little bit from everybody. As far as when I was writing this, like, one of my favorite books is over here. It's Shamrock by Jonathan Snowden, a friend of mine.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys read that one, but
He came on the show. He was great.
fantastic.
It's
And
such a good book.
it's a fantastic book. So, John, I'm sorry, I probably just completely copied. Actually, if I did copy it, I would feel good about it, because that means it would be good, because he's a much better writer than I am. But yeah, I'm sure I took kind of pieces from everything, and just kind of just the way that I've reported and written over the years about MMA and UFC and combat, and WWE a little bit too. I've done a good amount of wrestling stuff for ESPN as well. So yeah, I guess yeah. I guess you have
I
to read it to
imagine there's
find
got to be
out.
a desire on your end though, like to the journalistic approach sort of, I think, lessens the risk that you're talking as a fan, or talking as, or doing a full nostalgia trip. I have to imagine that was part of your mind as well. Is you watched this when you were younger, you were excited to write the book, but you don't want to go in, and certainly if you're on the phone with Eric Bischoff probably takes more than a few calls these days, but you still don't want to act like you're geeking out. You want to bring the same integrity to your day to day, your 9 to 5, as you would to this extra gig now, to this other gig you have going on. So I imagine there was the journalistic element, I think, is a nice protective layer there, where like you're asking objective questions to hopefully objective people, and trying to piece together an honest narrative, as opposed to maybe dipping too far one way or the other, or allowing someone to sway you because you're like, oh, I'm on the phone with this person, I know surely they must be telling me the truth. Like, if they're contradicted by 3 other people, well, that does even things out a little bit.
That's one of the most important things that I've tried to do, like, my entire career as a journalist, is not, because I mean, ultimately, look, I don't think you get into writing about MMA unless you're a big fan of it, and I was, and I still am. But I didn't let that color any of my reporting or any of my writing when I was writing for different outlets covering MMA. And now that I'm covering the NFL for ESPN, I've been a big NFL fan my entire life, right? I mean, it's the NFL. It's like the pinnacle, and that's how I feel. But I'm not gonna let that color anything, that I do as far as journalism goes. And same thing for when I write about WWE. I interviewed Stone Cold for ESPN back in, like, last November or December, and I was nervous. I was nervous as hell to interview Stone Cold, and but I didn't. I did not let that change how I was going to interview him, and I tried to apply that to the book as well. It's like, my job is to serve the fans, to serve the readers, and that's what I'm thinking about 100% of the time when I'm writing. It's not a vanity project. It's like, how can I deliver? How can I serve the people that are going to end up buying this book? And it's the same thing that I think when I'm writing an article, or reporting on an article. How can I serve the reader? How is the fan going to take this? What are they going to like about it? And that's, I work for the fans. I work for the people who are going to consume the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of consuming the product, you mentioned, Mark, that you watched many, many hours of WCW programming. I don't know if you still watch the product today, but in going back
I
through
do.
down, okay, but perhaps not as religiously as we did when we were younger, and it was
Sure.
appointment viewing. But regardless of all that, going back and watching that versus watching now, what are your takeaways? Like, I mean, obviously there was some stuff about back then that was transcendent, and there was a lot of filler and a lot of bullshit that I think doesn't happen these days. So where do you stand now that you've consumed, you've taken a long trip back down memory lane?
Everything back then seemed like so organic and authentic. I mean, I know that's kind of a weird word to use when you talk about professional wrestling, right? Because it's the opposite of authentic in most cases. But everything felt like anything could happen in WCW in that period of time. Like you just didn't know what to expect. And I think there's kind of a formula that wrestling has fallen into now in the 2010s and the 2020s that is different than like the fly by your seat of your pants 1990s pro wrestling where they were literally just figuring out as they went along. I mean, primetime wrestling on a national level, there really wasn't anything like right until Raw and then Nitro. So live, most shows were taped. There were studio shows before, but these were live shows in an arena, Monday night, 2 hours, 3 hours, and you got to come up with something, right? And a lot of it was just completely chaotic and insane. And now it's much tighter. The production is better. And I don't mean to say that like there's definitely positives to that too, but it feels like kind of glossier and it feels more corporate and it feels more manufactured and processed. Where, pun intended, that stuff back then felt more raw. It really did. It felt more like, oh man, I don't really know what's gonna come next. Because I'm not conditioned to expect a certain thing to come next. I really have no idea.
So I think having revisited 500 hours of 90s
Insane number.
Yeah, right.
It sounds impossible.
The idea of
Oh
that
my god,
because there's a lot of, to your point, there's a lot of authentic moments, unscripted, like only could have been produced at that time and day. And there was also probably some jobber matches that you probably want to forget and never want to remember. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because this is my favorite like wrestling trivia question. We've asked each other, and I ask is, can you tell me who was in the ring the moment Scott Hall interrupted for that first time?
Yeah, of course, Mike Enos and Steve Dahl.
I literally looked that up this morning just so like I need to make sure I fact check myself, and then I forgot it like 20 minutes later because
they're an incredibly forgetful duo. They're the most, which is probably why that match was happening. But still, those guys.
I tried so hard to get Mike Enos on the phone for this book, and I emailed him, and I think he has he owns a business down in Florida, and I emailed the business, I called the business, and I don't know. I guess the guy just doesn't want to talk about it. I don't know why.
I mean,
but there was another person in the ring too. It was referee Nick Patrick, and I did interview him for the book, and he was fantastic.
Oh, wow. That's fun. I didn't even think about that.
And he has done very, very few interviews since Starrcade 1997. Very few.
Wow. That's a selling point right there, honestly. That perks me up just hearing that. Oh, Nick Patrick.
What does that guy have to say? Yeah. Any other just like surprising memories? Like there's so much NWO. And at one point, there's so many members that you just forget who was in it. Mm-hmm. You forget like what happened from week to week. Like, what's like a top thing? Like, oh yeah, when I revisited, that thing happened, and that was so bizarre. Just reliving that.
Well, one thing that I really that I just kind of forgot about, and I think because he's around like these days, and he's not nowhere near like as popular, is just how damn over Conan was in the late 90s and like 98 especially, when he we're talking about Wolfpack Conan with Nash, and he's got his own like rap song, and that dude is one of the top 5, if not top 3 most over people on the damn roster in 1998. He is getting massive pops every single Thunder or Nitro. And one of the best things, one of the funniest things is like he's doing his he's doing his shtick, right? He's doing like his chants, and it's in Spanish, right? Orale, arriba la raza, right? And he's doing it like in Kentucky or like, Alabama. And they're repeating it along with them, and like they don't know what they could have been saying anything as far as they knew, right? And that was one of the coolest things. It's like you got like some, and all due respect, some redneck wrestling fans from like, Alabama chanting in Spanish because that's how over Conan was. It didn't matter. He was so freaking cool at that time. People see him now, he's down in Mexico. He's booking AAA, and he's working with TNA and MLW over the last few years, and people forget just how damn popular that guy was in the U.S. He was huge in Mexico, obviously, but in the U.S. during that time, '98, there were not 10 more over wrestlers on the planet than Conan and the Wolfpack.
Wow. I believe it because you watched it, and I'm not going back to check the tape. So I'm going to take your word for it in full. But that probably, for some people in those states, that might be the first Mexican person they've seen in a while. So like that really might have blown their minds.
He's not even Mexican, though. That's the thing. He's not even Mexican. He was just playing Mexican. His character was Mexican.
That's right. That's a good point. That's a very good point. First man speaking Spanish they'd seen in a while.
That's right. If maybe ever.
Yeah, perhaps. Well, Marc, this has been so great to talk about the book. Again, it's called Say Hello to the Bad Guys. Anything else? How would you, if you want people to purchase it, what's the best way for them to do that right now?
I mean, right now it is available on pre-order wherever you pre-order books. Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble, it's on Target. If you just Google Say Hello to the Bad Guys, how pro wrestling's New World Order changed America, how professional wrestling's New World Order changed America, you'll find it pretty easily on there, and you can pre-order it. It comes out again, March 25th, 2025. And yeah, I mean, it's like if that period of time meant something to you, I recommend picking up the book because it meant something to me, and I tried my darndest to live up to that great subject matter. That's
a great pitch. And I can guarantee you we'll be covering it on Awesome Truth, and maybe we'll bring you back and we'll talk about it once we've read it. So we're very excited. We read about one book a year now, so this might be our one book for 2025, but one wrestling book that is. But
by the way, it's very hard to read books when you're writing a book. Like I haven't read. I read books to research. I read Eric Bischoff's book. I read Hulk Hogan's book again, and I read a bunch of that stuff. Bret Hart's book, which I had already read, but it's hard to freaking read other books when you're. When you're trying, I read the Ringmaster by Abraham Reisman.
Yeah,
I don't know if you guys had it
on the show as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Another good one. That's the one we read last year, I think. So.
Okay, there you go. Well, so this will be the one for 2025.
Oh, we're very excited to have it already lined up. That's great. All right, thanks so much, Marc.
Thank you, guys.
Marc Raimondi, what a treat. Keep an eye out for his book in 2025. And if you want to hear more awesome truth about Hulk Hogan, the NWO, WCW, any number of topics in that vein, you can find our archives at awesometruth.libsyn.com. You can also subscribe to us for old episodes of new Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever podcasts are delivered, we are there. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, the truth will set you free.